Good evening. Thank you. I'm back home in Wiradjuri country. I actually do welcome to country in Gadigal country in Sydney and Redfern. They accept me for that as we are custodians of the land. And I always say I'm Wiradjuri, I'm from Cowra, I'm from the Lachlan Valley, the Galera, and I always ask people and they always say, it's beautiful country. And indeed it is. I'm the youngest child of 11 children that my parents, Louisa Agnes Simpson, who married Norma Ingram, so we had 11 children. Unfortunately, there were 7 girls and 4 boys. Unfortunately, all my brothers have passed away. And this year I've lost Sister Pamela, and last year we lost our older sister Sylvia. Sylvia's story is magnificent in itself as well. She was actually the first Aboriginal student to go to school in the town. And it was a bit of an experiment to see if the Aboriginal children could succeed in the town school. Prior to that, there was a school on the mission, because Aboriginal kids were not allowed to go into the town school. And her story is that she ended up being, her funeral was at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. It seats 2,000 people, and that church was full. And it had people like the Lord Mayor, Clovermore, it had the federal member, Tanya Plebiscite, the then Premier, Christina Keneally, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Catherine Byrne, and of course our friend, the Governor. And these people were all personal friends of my sister Sylvia. And they went there to honour life and her story. So there are some wonderful people around here. I just have wonderful things. And I'm very proud. Life for me on the mission, around the mission, as a child, for me it was fantastic. Because my family was there. But I remember going to, if I chop and change, that's okay. But I remember going to Teachers College at Sydney University. I went to Teachers College there, and I remember, because I always tell my story, I always share the story because I think that's important. And one of my classmates said, well, why didn't you just walk off the reserve if it was so bad? And I thought about that. I thought, okay, there may have been a lot of things that wasn't good about it, but that's where my family is. That's where my mother's country is. That's where my culture is. That's my connection. Where else was I going to go? And it was always good. It was fun. We may not have had running water on the reserve. And when I was born, we just had little red huts. And again, and I'll swap about the stories about the reserve and my family members, but I always remember my sister Sylvia telling me about the old red huts. And so it was 4 walls, and it had it was tin, and so Sylvia said when she grew up, all she wanted was a glass window, a window with a glass pane in it, because in the summertime it was like that corrugated iron stuff, no? And in the summer it was so hot, and in the winter it was so cold. And I remember we even lived, my family, before I was born, lived just off the mission in a little humpy, sort of, with dirt floor. So when I think about me coming from Irambi Mission to graduate from Harvard University in Cambridge, I often think, oh my goodness, how did I do that? And I had to leave I had 3 children at the time, and I left my children back in Sydney at home with my mother and my other sister Millie. And when I got to Los Angeles, my father had passed away here, and they brought him back to Cowra and buried him from Cowra. So I couldn't go to my father's funeral. But these things, if you sit back and wonder why, you may never know. So I always, when the door is open, just do that. But if I can just take you back a little bit, because as a kid in Cowra, I was separated from the rest of the town. I lived on the reserve, that's where my family was. I walked We didn't have the bus. I walked from Irambin across the old bridge, not the new bridge here, to go to school. And that's what I did. I went to school and I went home. And I didn't think about it much as a kid. But then as I grew up, I learned about what had happened to our people, to the Aboriginal people. Not just here in Cowra, but the policies of the government towards Aboriginal people and what had happened. And then if you take it right back, this country was founded on a concept called terra nullius. And the idea of terra nullius, when the colony was set up, that there was no human beings who lived on this land. And years down the track we have Eddie Marber, who did native title, who said that was a myth. But it took a long, long time. It took from 1788 until 1993 to say, yes, there were actually human beings living on this land. And indeed, in 1967, we, as Aboriginal people, with the support of a lot of non-Aboriginal people, had to go to the Australian public, right across this country, to ask the Australian public if we could be citizens of this country. 1967. We were not counted in the census. We were considered under the Fauna and Flora Act. So some of these things, you know, as a kid on the mission I didn't know these things. It wasn't till later that I grew up and I started to learn. I went to school, because I never really learnt anything much at school either about us. And there was stuff on the reserve that you know, some of the old people told. But what had happened too is that under some of those policies, we were forbidden to practice our culture on those reserves. We were forbidden to speak our language. So the old people, I still remember hearing some of the old people speak in some of the language, and we just used words. We picked up some of the words, and I still speak some of the words now. But when you think about it, we were under the government control under first the Aboriginal Protection Act and then the Aboriginal Welfare Act. The Aboriginal Protection Act took us off the traditional lands and brought us together and put us on the reserves like Irambin. The Aboriginal Welfare Act then wanted to take us off the reserves and move us into town to assimilate us. And so when you think about all this, I wonder we're a little bit confused sometimes. And when you think about, okay, when we were on the reserve under the Aboriginal Protection Act, when we weren't allowed to practice our culture, we weren't allowed to own property, we weren't allowed to speak our language, do our dances, do our songs, like those gorgeous young children did at the high school today, you know, with the artwork on them and the pride. I just looked at those young kids today and I saw that pride and I thought, wow, that is fantastic. Let's keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. But you still have to understand some of those things that happened in the past to us. And so we weren't allowed to, we couldn't go off the reserve unless we asked the permission of the mission manager. If you came off the reserve, if you went back on the reserve. But one of the worst things that the government did, and I'm not saying any individuals here, but this was policy. It is real. It's what happened. And the worst thing, I think, one of the worst things, is they took our babies away. They took our children away. They took them away from family, culture, land, and they put them into institutions they called homes. The babies went down to Bomaderry, and when they became a certain age, around about 11, 12, the girls were getting separated and put into Cootamundra, down south, and the boys were taken away and put up into Kempsey. That was from about the 1880s right up until the 1970s that this happened. And folks, it's right there in our country. It's right there in our backyard. This is what happened. And for too long, I think there's been parallel society amongst us as Aboriginal people, and I hate to do this, but I will do it for the exercise, us as Aboriginal people and the rest of the town. And you can go into any little town around this country and you'll see these parallel societies happening. What do we need to do so that we can all come together. Caroline mentioned Aboriginal reconciliation. You know, I see hope with our young kids at the school and what's happening with Robin, you know, being there and Cheryl and Harry. I think we've got Harry somewhere. You know, being there in our schools. We need this, but we need to say we care. And I'm sure we all do, but we need to say to our people, we need to say to our kids, I care about you. You are important. You contribute to society. What you have to offer is important to us. Sorry, this picture theatre in the main street on Offamy here, when I was a kid, it was roped off. Four seats in the front. That's where Aboriginal people sat out the front. You were not allowed to sit behind that. Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, white people, were not allowed to fraternise. Now that was very interesting when under the Aboriginal Welfare or Assimilation Act, they gave us what was called a certificate of exemption. So if you proved to be clean living, if you wanted to send your children to school, if you wanted to get a job, if you wanted to go in the pub, you had to apply for what was called a certificate of exemption. And that exempted you from being an Aboriginal person. It exempted you from being an Aboriginal under the Aboriginal Welfare Act, identifying as an Aboriginal. So, you know, a lot of our people wanted that because they believe it gave our people and our kids, particularly being able to send the kids to school. And my cousins had that certificate of exemption, or what they was called a dog tag. But what that also meant is that your family, the Aboriginal family, you couldn't talk to them because it was against the law. Because you are now not an Aboriginal because you got your piece of paper. Or what about your relatives? You can't talk to them. So there were some really, really strange policies. And
move forward and
we lived through
that.
Again, I'll tell you a little story about my sister. You know, I hope I haven't been preaching things like divisiveness or anything like that. I'm just trying to point out, I think it's really important. And I'll just read this. This country does have the capacity, and I'm sure most that are willing to embrace Aboriginal culture as a fundamental aspect of who we are as Australians. Acceptance, tolerance, sharing. These are the values to which we must aspire to in this country. Remember, Aboriginal history is Australian history. Aboriginal culture is part and parcel of Australian history. You can't compartmentalise Aboriginal people, our culture, our history, and sit us in a little box in the corner and pull it out every now and again and say, oh, we've got Aboriginal culture here. Oh, we've got Aboriginal people here. You just can't do that. I know that people care. People want to contribute. And we do need to work together. Don't blame the victim and don't play the victim. Either one of them. It takes the effort of the community as a whole to make a difference and be whole. Not just one side, not just either side. It may be one step forward and one step backwards, but please do not stand still. We need to make those changes and we need to be open-minded and caring and lend out and reach out that open hand. Let's have a look where we can employ Aboriginal people in our towns. All of those gorgeous young people at the school this morning, where are they going to go when they leave school? Are they going to stay here in Cowra and get good jobs? Or do they have to go to Sydney or Orange or somewhere else or Dubbo, to get a job? And not just because they're Aboriginal specific jobs either. Where can you, personally, individually, and I'll put that challenge out to you, where individually, as a citizen of Cowra, can you make a difference? Where can Cowra as a whole make a difference? I wouldn't mind coming back here in a couple of years' time and seeing those differences. Look, take care everyone. Good health to you all. I really appreciate all of you coming and listening to me. I hope I haven't sounded too radical. I haven't ever. And sometimes I think we need to say some of these things. But I just wanted to finish off with saying, look, I think my journey has been a great journey. I've loved my journey. I've loved coming off around ammunition and that journey. It's been hard. It hasn't been easy at all. Particularly, you know, when my mother was so ill and her journey, my family's journey, what we've done. But you won't get that done if you just sit back and sit still. When the door opens, step through, and that's what I like to say to those gorgeous young children at the school. You know, we can't do it for ourselves. Let's do it for our future generations, so the next generation that we see in the future will be much, much brighter and much better. Thank you, everyone. I think I'm open for questions if you want.